Welcome to the latest episode of the Informing Choices mini-pod. This is episode 4 in our series exploring the critical trends that could impact the future of work in collaboration with Working the Future. In this episode, we're tracking a topic that's on everyone's lips: how and why our attitudes towards work are changing dramatically. It's not just about where we work, but how we want to work and what we expect from our employers. Intrigued? We'll start by looking at the latest evidence and what it reveals about these shifting attitudes. What's really driving the workforce of today and tomorrow? Then we'll identify 3 major forces behind these changes. Is it generational shifts, technological advancements, or perhaps the evolving social and economic landscapes? And because the future is never set in stone, we'll explore both sides of the coin. What are the optimistic and pessimistic scenarios for work by 2030? How could these changes enhance or disrupt our work lives? Then, to wrap things up, we'll discuss how these changes drive some practical steps that organizations can take right now, and armed with these insights, prepare for a future that's just around the corner. So whether you're a leader, a policymaker, or just navigating your own career path, this episode is just right for you. And as before, I'm delighted to be able to welcome once again founding co-director of Working the Future, Cathryn Barnard, to this collaborative series of podcasts. Cat, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
You are very welcome. So I said there that we're going to look at the evidence. So what have you found in compiling the report that really explores beautifully some of these meta trends? What has the evidence told you about the shifting attitudes to work?
I think the one thing that we really do need to pay attention to and be attuned to the entire time is how big meta global events go on to reshape societal attitudes, expectations, and behaviours. So, for instance, even before COVID, we were tracking a range of shifts in worker preferences towards work. Just to cite a couple of examples, demand for flexible and remote working was well on the uptick before the pandemic hit. The average length of tenure on permanent work contracts was reducing. It was clear that attitudes towards permanent work had changed, and actually, if you track that back, you can see quite clearly that the financial crisis of 2008 had a clear impact on worker attitudes. I think, looking back, I think we can probably all agree, the economic recovery, I say that really loosely because did we actually ever really recover? But the economic recovery was contingent on organizations being able to access ever more tenuous employment types. So, for instance, we saw the rise of 0-hour contracts after 2008, and generally a kind of tacit erosion of work and job security. So people's attitude to work had already changed prior to the pandemic. The pandemic has poured rocket fuel on attitudes to work. I think very germanely, it caused people to, it was quite existential, those long weeks and months of lockdown. It caused us all to perhaps contemplate more full-bloodedly the meaning of life and what constitutes a life well led. And it certainly caused a lot of people to quit jobs that they didn't feel satisfied by or motivated by. And then, of course, lots of things were said by magnanimous leaders in the months of lockdown and after we all were allowed some semblance of social freedoms. Things like oh, well, you know, we're going to adapt, we're going to work from home forever, we're going to be flexible, we're going to put you guys first. And as we sit here in 2024, the headlines seem continuously full of leaders making big statements that row back on all kinds of promises that were made. And, you know, I think we have to fully understand, you know, shifting attitudes towards work, we have to take a step back and look at the various intersections and interplays and how big events that are reported in the media can go on to subtly fine-tune how people perceive work in society.
I think that example you gave just then of you know, a number of leaders sort of changing what they'd said during the pandemic about how we work, you know, remote work, hybrid work, and so on. It's kind of about trust, isn't it? Because if you say one thing and then do something else, it kind of damages the relationship between employer and employee simply because the trust is broken down.
Yeah, and that's a massive, massive point that you raise, because in parallel, whilst these about turns are taking place, we're also increasingly aware of a growing gap between the 1% of rich folk who own the wealth and the rest of us. And so, you know, wage inequality is really under the spotlight, not least because of the ongoing cost of living crisis. And I think it does beg the question, particularly as younger cohorts enter the workplace, why should anybody work here? Why should I work for you? What are you going to give me that would give me cause to almost entrust my attention and my focus to you? So trust is absolutely requisite. I just don't think we carry the same societal norms that we once did around work. And I think, interestingly, and I think we could probably talk about this for hours, and I know we're on a tight time frame, but you know, if you think about the way in which the country, the United Kingdom, gathered together in the aftermath of the Second World War to rebuild the country, its infrastructure, and a strong semblance of societal cohesion. You know, we saw in the aftermath of the Second World War things like the birth of the NHS, which was very much grounded in society and equality. But we're 75 or so years, how 70 odd years, nearly 80 years, at 80 years next year from the end of the Second World War. And for increasing numbers of people, that's an anathema, isn't it? Like you can't get your head around what the 50s and 60s might have consisted of in terms of social cohesion. And then, of course, on top of that, you know, without making this a political conversation, there are many who feel that conservative politics have encouraged peak individualism and peak competition in a way that has completely deconstructed a sense of community and a sense of society. So if we're immersed in a culture where everybody's in it for themselves, what entertain me, make this workspace worth my while showing up.
I feel pretty sure we're going to come back to that point about the kind of changing nature of the relationship between employee and employer, because I think there's some fascinating trends, perhaps a little bit deeper down in there, and particularly when we start to think of the future, that could really, really change that dynamic. But for now, let's kind of switch to some of the key drivers that you think are behind this trend, and let's find three of them. Well, you know, what are the three drivers that you think are really underpinning the changing nature of the relationship between the workforce and employers?
Well, I've probably touched on a couple of them already. I think we
Yeah.
cannot underestimate the impact that the 2008 crash had on the mental construct of work. It eroded for once and for all, a semblance of job stability. And there's a really interesting book that I read a few years back called How to Raise an Adult by an American lady called Julie Lythcott-Hames, and she was Vice Dean of Admissions at one of the big American universities, either Stanford or Harvard or whatever. And she wrote this brilliant paragraph in this book that just packed all the punches about the economic backdrop against which millennials graduated out of university and entered the labour market. And she talked about things like, you know, the level of student debt, because of course in America, tertiary education isn't free, nor is it free here, by the way. And I think, you know, I may have mentioned before, I think we emulate a lot of, you know, we eventually emulate a lot of American culture. So the staggering amount of student debt, inability to access permanent work at a level that you had believed, because the system had told you you would access opportunity once you graduated. In fact, in the aftermath of 2008, you were offered maybe unpaid internships, 0-hour contracts, maybe opportunity in retail and hospitality whilst you waited to try and get your foot in the door of the profession that you had educated yourself in preparation for. She talked about the lifelong financial impact of graduating into a recession and what that means for lifelong earnings, and gave some really interesting data points there. But generally, if I was to call it, I would say generally, as big organizations did what they could to stabilize and shore up their reserves, they treated humans abysmally and as disposable resources. And as we are now seeing in the context of COVID, if you treat people poorly, people have long memories, and also every organization that contributes to an economic ecosystem has a responsibility for shaping that ecosystem, whether they recognize it or not. So every organization that treats humans as disposable resources reshapes the labor market. So that's my point one. My point two, which I've already referenced, is you know, the growing inequality between rich and poor. And I was just thinking about this last night. I pulled up some data from the World Economic Forum, which will be 3 years old now, so it's dated 2021. But on the World Economic Forum website, they had noted that the richest 10% of people globally own 76% of all global wealth. So again, you know, what we're seeing right now in 2024 is a rising tide of young people saying, hold on a minute, why would I bust my gut making a very small subset of humanity richer than they already are, when they are already, you know, billionaires, if not trillionaires, and instead of using that wealth for greater societal good, they're shooting rockets up into space or trying to colonize Mars or some other completely crazy, nonsensical idea. And, you know, if you listen carefully to the kind of the jungle drum, and it's enthralling to me, people are starting to talk about hustle culture as a modern form of colonialism. Wow. You know, so again, why should I work for you?
Yeah.
And then the final piece that I would point to, which I know we've nodded to in previous episode, is you know, the impact of technology. I don't think we can understate the impact that the internet has had on culture and society, and just the extent to which it has increased transparency and proliferated choice. people have more choice than ever before in where they work and who they work for. And I would compound that with, certainly in the UK, where the housing ladder, the property market is out of control, and it's becoming more and more difficult to access affordable property. People are no longer tied to location in a way that they would have been 25, 30 years ago, because they're not paying a mortgage. They're not fixed in a set location because they've bought a house, and it would just be nonsensical to think about moving. If you're only ever able to rent, you become immediately more flexible in where you can move to, in a way that again erodes job permanence.
That last one is interesting because that kind of job permanence, or the kind of the diminishing level of job permanence, is starting to put the power back into the work colleague rather than the employer, isn't it? And that's one of these kind of longer term trends that I think could be really fascinating in the future, whereby we might see a situation where it's the candidates that actually interview the potential employer rather than employers interviewing candidates, because actually all the things you've spoken about are so important that the key talent actually really wants to know how they're going to be treated when they join an organization.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure. I mean, we're hearing stories already of people that are graduating university and they're going into their first graduate job, and it's just not stacking up for them. It's just not what they hoped it would be. Who knows what they hoped it would be? It could be down
Yes.
to what reels that have been watched on Instagram. It could be down to, stories that they were told at university or at college or at school. It could be down to a whole range of things. But the point is, there are certain stories emerging that grads are quitting after 12, 18 months, having stockpiled enough money to go travelling, and then going off travelling for however long, and then coming back, re-entering the job market and doing the same again. And, you know, who can blame them in a lot of regard? Who can blame them, right? What is there to look forward to? What is there to tie somebody to place and space and a cause and so on? And of course, on the one hand, what I have just articulated is not true of all young adults, but in equal measure, if you're not telling a story as an employer that is really compelling about what you stand for, what you're here in the world to deliver, something that transcends massive, shareholder returns, then what are you offering to a young adult that is game changing?
That really starts to broaden the debate, doesn't it? And in a future episode, we're going to be looking, of course, at talent ecosystems. And the other thing that struck me while you were talking then was that we're seeing these perhaps younger people, and actually I suppose increasingly not so young people, doing exactly as you described, going traveling and so forth. But it's the realization that there is an opportunity to work to live rather than live to work, which has been a debate, obviously, that's been ongoing for years and years, but it really seems to be coming to the fore, I think, at the moment, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And like, as we talked about in the last episode, when we looked a little bit at globalization and geopolitics, like the world is anything but stable, and nobody knows what's around the corner. And if you've got disposable income, and let's face it, some people that are locked out of the housing market have got more disposable income to some degree, because they don't have the burden of a mortgage around their necks. Why would you not go out and tick those bucket list items off? Because it could be, to all intents and purposes, in a reasonably short period of time, we might be restricted from traveling. If war breaks out in the Middle East, if war expands in Europe,
Mm.
traveling might become really restricted.
Yeah.
The climate crisis could well restrict travel. So why not go out and do those things whilst you can?
Let's take that. Let's do something while you can, which feels a little bit more optimistic into the next question. The next question was actually thinking about what could be an optimistic outcome with the changing nature of our attitudes to work, but what could be also be a pessimistic outcome, because we need to make sure that we keep both of those potential outcomes in mind, don't we? So what do you see as a pessimistic outcome? What do you see as an optimistic outcome?
Well, bluntly, I see a pessimistic outcome coming into play if organisations do not take it upon themselves to evolve, adapt, and meet the needs of modern workers. We know we've got a shrinking labour market, we've got an ageing population, and a diminishing number of people entering the labour market to replace boomers who are retiring. So it is incumbent on any organisation that wants to sustain itself and future-proof to adapt and upgrade its operating behaviour to accommodate an increasingly diverse set of wants and needs. And that requires organisations to listen, to deploy pragmatism, to exhibit mutuality, and to co-create working conditions that work inclusively for the greatest number of internal stakeholders. And I think that's the only way to go, bluntly, because the alternative, which is very pessimistic, is that organisations collapse simply because they have failed to adapt. And I find myself quite pragmatic about that outcome as well, because if you look to nature, species that fail to adapt eventually go extinct. Did I say that
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
And I think what's interesting about what you've said there, there's plenty of evidence around that does suggest if organizations don't change, then they do go extinct. I know on one particular index, the S&P 500, I think it was McKinsey looked at the rate at which organizations come into the index, mature, and then die. And they talk about a very significant shortening of a corporation's lifespan. So, there's lots of evidence that does suggest that organizations, if they don't adapt, are on pretty thin ice.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got the kind of, for some listeners, they might be quite historic examples now, but look at the rise and fall of BlackBerry research in motion, the BlackBerry mobile phone. Look at the rise and fall of Kodak.
Yeah.
Kodak couldn't believe that, photographs would go digital. Same with Blockbuster. There are enough examples in modern corporate history to evidence that extinction is a reality for those that don't shift their mindset.
So, with the warning of possible extinction on the one hand, and the promise of through adaptation, a brighter future, what action do you think organizations can take now with this insight to prepare themselves for the changing nature of our attitudes to work?
Great question. Straight off the bat, I would say organizations need to get curious with as a point of urgency. They need to start asking better questions to both their existing team members, but also to potential new hires, to really get under the bonnet of what modern workers want and how they want to work. I think it's a fine balance between understanding and accommodating individual work preferences and setting clear expectations around what practices need to be in play for business continuity. So I think growing up, actually, organizations need to grow up and be willing to have some adult conversations about the new work landscape. So educating themselves is absolutely prerequisite. Getting curious, doubling down on accommodating an ever expanding array of unique preferences and needs. I think in step with that, organizations need to focus on deploying and exhibiting transparent ethical, value-driven behavior for enhanced equity. So I think also starting to recognize that organizations are biological organisms because they consist of human beings, and recognizing the motivations and drivers of fellow human beings. It's extraordinary, isn't it, that we can accommodate one another in our familial and in our social groups, but we are very, very poor at accommodating one another in our workplace settings. And then finally, banging on a drum, I think, you know, the golden age of internal communication is upon us. Communication is key. Communication is the bedrock by which trust and relationship and goodwill and loyalty build. And I think organizations need to get massively better at communicating internally, but also equipping their leaders and their managers with the skills that underpin excellent communication. And it's a sad reality. I think it was the Chartered Management Institute produced some research in late 23 showcasing that something like 87% of managers haven't had any training in management. So there's a lot of room for improvement.
There is a lot of room for improvement. And I guess if I was to kind of encapsulate a lot of what you've been talking about, for me, it felt like humanizing work and the workplace.
Yeah, 100%. And you know what? It's been talked about for at least a decade and a half. And yet here we are. But, you know, as organizations fail to change, their circumstances become almost existential, in threat. This is non-negotiable. You can resist it for as long as you like, but the longer that you resist it, the more likely you are to drive your business into the ground, and then you'll have nothing.
As the Vogons said, resistance is useless. Cat, thank you so much for your time. We could go on talking about this for hours and hours, I know, but I think this has been absolutely fascinating. In the podcast description, you'll find a link to the Working the Future website and how you can get in touch with Cat to find out more about the work that Working the Future do. In the meantime, thank you everyone for watching and listening. Do subscribe so you never miss another episode, and tell your friends and colleagues about the Informing Choices mini pod. And I'll see you next time.